scholar from New York University School of Law. He is the former chief representative of the United Nations of the International Student Movement of the United Nations. He is currently a consultant of Middle East Affairs for Congressional Quarterly, the National Geographic Society, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholarship at the Smithsonian. He is also a Washington representative for the World Jewish Congress. Mr. Bruzonsky is the founder and publisher of Mideast Realities, MiddleEast.org. For more information, it says in the handbook as well, please turn to page 32 afterwards to look at a list of bibliography and more biography. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Mark Bruzonsky.
Young people in this room are about to inherit a very dangerous and potentially chaotic world. Most of you are Americans, citizens of the most advanced and most privileged country. And those privileges, coupled with your own interest in world affairs and the United Nations, bring with them very new and quite extraordinary responsibilities. Thank you very sincerely for this invitation to speak with you this evening as you begin what I am sure will be a tremendously educational experience at this very special University of Chicago Law UN. Thank you especially, as I'm well aware, my name is not Mary Robinson or Ramsey Clark or Ralph Nader, and that few of you have heard my name before this evening. Indeed, in past years, usually persons working for or with the United Nations in one way or another have spoken to you from this forum. And they have usually focused on the UN system itself, human rights issues, and very frankly, matters not necessarily very controversial. Some might even say safe. But in many ways, including psychologically, the world of the roaring '90s, which is all most of you have directly experienced in your lives until lately, also crashed on 11 September. And I expect there are now many crashes of various kinds ahead of all of us, political, economic, as well as military. There are real and serious reasons our world is in such turmoil and danger today. There are real and serious reasons. There are suicide bombers in that great city which represents the focal point of most of our religious faiths, Jerusalem, a marvelous and unique city where I have spent considerable time. There are real and serious reasons young people your age and other places are choosing to become what Americans call terrorists and what they themselves call martyrs and freedom fighters. And there are real reasons, real grievances, real and profound struggles which lie behind what happened on September 11th. For we are not in a new war at all. Rather, we are in a new phase of an ongoing war in which millions of people in faraway countries have already been killed, in many cases, by policies and forces and allies of our own country. And so it is with these responsibilities and this new situation in mind that I have chosen to diverge from the safe subjects and deal with issues that will be crucial for your futures, for our country's future, and indeed for our entire world's future. This evening I want to speak with you not about general human rights, but about specific political and economic rights. Not about the successes of the United Nations, but about its failures and the great challenges it now faces. And most of all, I want to speak with you about a subject I personally know best and firsthand from over 150 visits to the Middle East region and 30 years of conferences and relationships since I was a student like you, about the Middle East peace process and why it has exploded into an orgy of even greater violence and despair than when it began. Most of the human rights problems in our world really have deep political, economic, and territorial roots. Basic issues of power and wealth are involved both at the national and international level. How we structure our society, who is really in control and why, are the truly crucial issues too often not truly discussed. The most challenging and basic issue of all is how our world's resources are owned and controlled and distributed, because that is what determines crucial things like how people are fed and clothed and housed, how people receive and in most cases do not receive health care, how people are able or unable to provide for themselves and their families and their futures. And sadly, unlike for us, win all wars, then we named World War I. The UN quickly became a world forum that in one way or another had to be, but it did not have to be long as it has. For today's UN has not lived up to either the dream or the promise of its founders. Most of all, it has not fulfilled its primary responsibility to achieve the kind of independence, credibility, and assertiveness on behalf of all the people of planet Earth, rather than on behalf of those most powerful and most wealthy. There have been far too many Security Council and General Assembly resolutions that have gone unheeded, unenforced, and in most cases unremembered. The major powers, especially the United States, have manipulated and empowered the UN far more than should have ever been allowed or tolerated. There is a terrible misdistribution of wealth on our planet, leaving the majority of human beings in poverty and despair. The UN by now should have far more seriously addressed this major dilemma in far more assertive and potent ways. There is an unprecedented environmental catastrophe looming. Projections from UN bodies warn that in the lifetime of most in this room, our planet could experience unprecedented environmental change, including as much as a 10-degree temperature rise, leading to calamities on a tremendous scale. The international arms race is terribly out of control, propelled, in fact, by the very powers in charge of the United Nations through the Security Council. An international military-industrial complex is fueling future warfare and potential Armageddon. And even if these terrible weapons of mass annihilation are controlled and never actually used, humankind is squandering the best of its talent and wealth, building ever-new generations of ever more frightful weapons rather than schools and hospitals and food for all. Nor has the UN and its many agencies properly prepared to seriously fight international disease and starvation, two plagues now ravaging the African continent and threatening much of humanity. By now, you may have realized that I have not included any jokes or one-liners in my talk with you this evening. Frankly, the situation we are all now in is simply too dangerous and too tragic for jokes or for pointing fingers at individual political personalities. What we need urgently to do is to focus our greatest attention on the big political and economic issues and institutions, and to find ways to restructure and manage them for the common good. That, in fact, was the original United Nations vision and dream. That is what you are challenged to be discussing, debating, and learning from each other about for the next three very intense days. We need to focus on resuscitating the United Nations, which itself is in a difficult predicament, desperately needing to find a way to be independent and potent. Though it is an organization of member states, it is urgently important it also become a far more democratic forum, and thus a far more respected forum, representing the peoples of our world, not just their often corrupt and self-serving, repressive and deceptive governments. Very frankly, the world's only superpower has done far too much controlling, manipulating, and measuring, and when it doesn't get its way, too much vetoing. Just a few months ago, before 9/11, the U.S. was nearly totally isolated at the important UN gathering in Durban, South Africa, blustering and bullying everyone nearly about everything relating to history, racism, and basic economic and political rights. And since 9/11, the U.S. has once again vetoed the Security Council resolution rightly seeking to provide some protection for the Palestinian people, whom it declared way back in 1947 should have a state of their own immediately. Indeed, let me now turn directly to that most controversial issue, the one the UN itself did like, and the one the UN has spent more time and energy and anguish dealing with than any other. Of course, I'm referring to the situation in what many still call the Holy Land, the area that was Palestine until 1947, the area now called Israel and the occupied territories. It is this very region which has given birth to modern-day terrorism, to airplane hijackings, suicide bombings, truck bombs, and political kidnappings. And today, because of the wrongs for which the United Nations and the United States are considerably responsible, it is now a region more fractured and divided and blood-soaked than it has been since biblical days. But that was a world of swords and crucifixions, the hearts of the world of nuclear and biological bombs. Your own schedule of sessions and debates at this model United Nations has the situation of the Middle East more prominent than any other, and rightly so. Many of you may find what I will now outline, what I'm going to now outline trouble. Many of you young Americans will wonder, how can what he is saying be true in view of what is usually said about these issues in the popular mass media in our country? Indeed, I still remember when I was a graduate student, how upset and disbelieving I was when Professor Richard Falk at Princeton first used such concepts as racism, war crimes, and apartheid when discussing the Arab-Israeli conflict. Then I was a student like you are today. Then I had not yet had a chance to travel the world, meet so many new people, hear so many new views, and ponder the great issues for myself. Now, more than 25 years later, when I have personally been so lucky to have had these opportunities, what I have to do is try to squeeze these 25 years into less than 25 minutes, now already half gone. All I can realistically do in the next few moments is share with you my own conclusions and then encourage you to start reaching your own conclusions. And in fact, in just a few minutes, when I have finished, I encourage you to start with the most difficult and important questions you can come up with to ask of me. Today, the situation in the Middle East is immensely worse than when I represented the international student movement before the United Nations at UN headquarters for 3 years. It has been made worse precisely by the Middle East peace process. And the basic reason is that all along, rather than a true peace process, it has been, and it is, a domination and subjugation and repression process. And we have all been taken for a ride. Let me try to explain what I mean in the following way. If you had invited any of the following much more distinguished speakers, most of whom I am fortunate to have as personal friends now, here is what they would have told you about the realities of the Middle East peace process. If you'd invited Professor Noam Chomsky, he would have told you, I'm quoting, the agreements incorporate the extremist version of U.S.-Israeli rejection and are closest to the Shalom plan of the early 1980s. They should be compared to the institution of that monstrous system of apartheid in the former South Africa upon the Palestinian people. If you had invited Professor Edward Said, there is a wanton murder of language evident in the phrase peace process. At a time when people are suffering and shabby leaders are reaping Nobel Prizes that only enable more exploitation, it is crucial to bear witness to the truth. Far from bringing peace, the agreement will bring great suffering for Palestinians and an assured threat to the Israeli people. Every leader involved in the Oslo peace process, Palestinian, Israeli, American, or European, has acted without principles and without anything remotely resembling vision and truthfulness. Worse, large droves of intellectuals, scholars, and experts have betrayed their vocations, to say nothing of their expertise and knowledge. And this betrayal has contributed to the amazingly compliant attitude of the American media in particular, who have celebrated, extolled, saluted, and rejoiced, where there has been neither occasion nor cause to justify such excessive hand-clapping and jubilation. If you had invited Dr. Riyad Siraj, Dr. Siraj is an extraordinary, distinguished Palestinian. He has his PhD in psychology by the way from Harvard. And he made these remarks 5 years ago at Georgetown University speaking for the Palestinians. We are not against the rule of law. In fact, we want the rule of law. We want fairness and equality before the law. We want to feel that the people have rights and they are dignified. After so many years of brutality and repression and humiliation at the hands of the Israelis, that is what people here are longing for, dignity and pride. Dr. Siraj then wrote an essay, and he courageously titled it, Why We Have All Become Suicide Bombers. This is 5 years ago now. Essay published throughout the world, except in the United States. And he concluded that essay struggle of Palestinians today is how not to become a bomb. And the amazing thing is not the occurrence of the suicide bombing, but the rarity of it. If you had invited Robert Fisk, the most distinguished and longest-serving Western correspondent in the region, 25 years right for the Independent in London, he made these remarks to me personally in an interview 5 years ago also, long before they were proved correct. I put peace process in quotation marks when I write about it in my newspaper. It's an American expression. It's definitely not a Middle East expression. All one can say about the peace process now is that it's dead, it's finished, it's over. And the most remarkable thing I find is coming now to the States is the degree to which people don't realize this. If you invited Peter Al-Bashamir, the man who represented as chairman of the Palestinian delegation, the Palestinian people in Madrid at the historic peace conference, and then at all the subsequent conferences up to Oslo. By the way, he didn't attend the White House Oslo peace signing because he predicted its outcome. He's not himself a member of Hamas, but here's what he said. How do we view the acts of resistance by Hamas and the attacks? How do we view the acts of resistance by Hamas and the Islamists? Palestinians are entitled to do so to all sorts of measures, including legitimate armed struggle to rid themselves of occupation. The Israeli position, which is based on Israeli military power, and with heedlessness toward legality and legitimacy and United Nations resolutions, is actually a cause for the violence. Israel, in recent time, killed so many Palestinians in cold blood. Palestinians that it apprehended and could have arrested, but it preferred to kill them. The world is going to realize that this peace process is not really a peace process, it is hopeless. And finally, though I could go on with many other quotations in this vein from many other people, had you invited Arun Ambujoy, winner of India's most prestigious $1 million literary prize, widely published throughout the world, except in the United States. Here's what she would have said about the recent 9/11 attacks on the United States. Could it be that the anger that led to the attacks has its taproot not in American freedom and democracy, but in the U.S. government's record of commitment and support to exactly the opposite things? To military and economic terrorism, insurgency, military dictatorship, religious bigotry, and unimaginable genocide outside America. With all due respect, she writes to President Bush, the people of the world do not have to choose between the Taliban and the U.S. government. All the beauty of human civilization, our art, our music, our literature, lies between these two fundamentalist ideological poles. There is as little chance that the people of the world can all become middle-class consumers as there is that they will all embrace any one particular religion. The issue is not about good versus evil or Islam versus Christianity as much as it is about space, about how to accommodate diversity, how to contain the impulse toward hegemony, every kind of hegemony, economic, military, linguistic, religious, and cultural. And if you will, please let me conclude with a startling poem, one which contains the seeds of possible salvation rather than capitalism. For if you had invited Israel's very well-known and respected playwright and television host Dan Elmore, he might have recited this poem to you. He wrote it during the first Palestinian Intifada after visiting the Palestinian city of Nablus for the very first time. Before writing it, he went back a second time to make sure, this time accompanied by his close friend, then the defense minister of Israel, none other than General Yitzhak Rabin, with whom he then parted ways. This poem is not just about Israelis and Palestinians, it's about all of us, and that's why I'd like to conclude with it. The title of the poem is We Shoot Children Too, Don't We? Most of these people truly desire to harvest their olive trees as they have for hundreds of years. Most of these people truly desire to raise their kids, not to throw stones or Molotov cocktails, but to study in peace, to play in peace, and raise a flag, their own flag, and facing that flag to cry as we did that night, then excited as we were. And we have no right in the world to rob them of this desire, this flag, these tears which always come after all others. Let us start preparing our defense. We will need it soon enough. Those who actually did it, and those who still do, and those who hushed it up, and those who still do, and those who said nothing, and those who clucked their tongue, saying, something must be done really, but not tonight. I have a concert to give and a birthday. Indeed, we'll all get our summons one day for the colonel's trials. The colonel's trials are coming. Their time will come, it must be so. The trials of the generals, the colonels, and the divisions, the battalion, the platoon commanders, there is no escaping it. This is how history works. What shall we say then? What will the colonels and captains of the corporals say? What will they say of those terrible beatings, the brutality of houses blown up, and most of all, the humiliation, that terrible humiliation? We turned a deaf ear, we turned a deaf heart, mean, arrogant, and dumb. Who do we think we are to be so deaf, so dumb? Ignoring the obvious, they are as human as we are, at least as we used to be. No less diligent, no less smart, as sensitive as full of hope. They love their wives and children as we do no less. And our children now shoot theirs with lead, plastic bullets, and gas. The Palestinian state will come to pass as well, not a poet wrote, this history will, and seasons will come and seasons will go, and life goes on as we bury our own. Weddings and birth and death, all the same, but just the shame of it, the shame. Thank you for listening to me this evening, and now it's your turn.
To ask questions. You'll also be with us throughout the weekend. You'll find 5 microphones positioned throughout the room, 4 microphones to the left, center back, to the right, and center front. We'll take questions from each in a clockwise direction, starting there and then moving around. So if you have questions, please proceed to the nearest microphone. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to thank you for your speech. I had a question about why the United States and the United Nations seems to think this peace process is a peace process, Why do you think that countries like the United States, as well as the UN as a whole, think that this peace process will bring peace? I guess I'm looking for alternatives. Now that we have this violence, what steps can we take? If we pull out right away, I guess, how can we transition into a period when we won't have to? What are our alternatives? I guess I'm asking to this peace process, which isn't a peace process at all. Not very completely said, but I appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you. Bruzonsky usually says when he's asked a question like that, he says the peace process in America is whatever the American government says the peace process is. Of course, there are alternatives. Of course, alternative policies can be put forward. But you ask, why has the peace process name caught on? Why has it been discussed in the way it has been discussed? And that's largely our own fault. I just read you quotes from a few of the world's most eminent thinkers and scholars and experts, Bruzonsky, Edward Said. Maybe you didn't know some of the other names, but they are all known throughout the world. They've been saying for 6 or 7 years that the peace process was a sham, was a hoax, would collapse, would lead to. It only has been discussed in that way in the last year, after the Camp David meeting, in which the United States and Israel attempted to impose on the Arab parties an agreement that Arafat wanted to sign but couldn't sign. He wanted to sign it because there was a lot of money and privilege associated with it. Now, we can't this evening, there's lots of other people that want to ask questions, get into a whole discussion, not right now, about what the alternatives to it are. The first thing one has to understand is that it wasn't a real process to begin with, and that's why it came apart.
In your speech, you alluded to the Durban conference earlier this year, and then you have compared the Durban conference to Resolution 3379 of 1975, and then you believe that's with Resolution 3379 with the Zionism is racism for the United Nations describing itself quite a bit. Do you agree that Resolution 3379 did in fact describe the United Nations, and do you believe that the Durban conference was similar to Resolution 3379?
The Durban conference wasn't about Zionism as racism. Is the mic on? Okay. Well, I'm not a hero on the mic. Thank you. I'll give it back to you. The Durban conference. I can try to shout, but I don't think. Quickly on the Durban Conference. The Durban Conference was a world conference with many, many issues to be discussed about many of the things that I talked about in my talk. The issue of Zionism is racism. If the majority of the world wants to meet in Durban, and if the majority of the world wants to pass a resolution saying this or saying that, then who are we in the United States, nearly totally isolated, without hardly any support, to bluster and badger and tell them we're not going to come, and tell them what they can do, and tell them that we're in charge and they aren't in charge. Everybody in this room may have their own view of whether Zionism is racism and what those terms mean. Obviously, I have my views over the years, which have somewhat changed based on the experiences and things that I've learned. But the important thing about Durban was that we needed an international conference about these issues. We needed it to be held, we needed there to be follow-up, and we needed the resolutions that they passed to be meaning, to be credible, and the United States undermined that and made that impossible.
Given the nature of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, the Israelis, of course, having at least democratic elements in their government, and given the fact that the attention of the world media is constantly focused on the Israeli-Palestinian situation, do you think it is somewhat foolish that the Palestinians embrace violence as a means to work their way out of the situation? Do you believe that before true peace can be achieved, the Palestinians will have to be the first ones to abandon their violent ways in addressing this issue?
Well, first of all, most violent ways are imposed by the military occupier, not by the party that's occupied. And second of all, any people who are subjected, be it in Kashmir, be it in Palestine, be it the blacks in South Africa during the days of apartheid, any people who are subjected to such terrible forms of oppression and discrimination react in various ways. There's no central party in Palestine that's calling the shots. There's just a lot of people. People your age have known nothing other than military occupation, torture, repression, knocks at the door. It's very difficult to understand it if you haven't visited and lived it. Dan Alvegor is a perfect example. This was the Johnny Carson of Israeli television. This was the master of ceremonies on Israeli national TV, a one-channel state in those days. everybody knew and adored. This was a funny man who made jokes from the podium. But when Intifada 1 started, he said he's going to drive over to Dallas, an hour away, and see for himself, and he was blown away. He's told me the story personally. He could not believe what he saw. He went to Rabin, his friend, and Rabin said, come back to Annapolis, I'm going to have all the commanding generals meet with you and explain to you why we're doing it. It didn't work. Dan's life changed, by the way. He no longer was master of ceremonies on Israeli TV. Yitzhak Shamir, that the prime minister, called him a traitor. His house was firebombed, his car was firebombed. Rabin told him to better leave the country because they couldn't protect him. But sometimes one has to pay a price for what's happening in the world. And all of you now are living in a totally different world. If this were a year ago, the speech wouldn't be given, the reactions wouldn't be what they are, and the whole context would be different. We're living in an extraordinarily dangerous world now. And after watching our president the other evening in the State of the Union, it's gotten even more dangerous in the last few days than I thought it was when I started writing these remarks. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I think it's wonderful that we're turning our eyes outside the United States and looking at the international community. That's what makes this conference so special. However, I would like to return to the United States because you mentioned why is there no such thing as a peace process, and I would like to pose the question of the United States as a hypocrite. How can the United States play a large role, presumably, in processes of reconciliation if within its own borders, under its social, political, and economic structure, there are continually lines drawn, binary oppositions drawn between different classes and races and economic groups, even political parties, associations made like that. My question for you is, what do you recommend for the United States and United States citizens to do to initiate maybe even a paradigm shift and get us to look beyond binary oppositions and recognize pluralism in people, diversity, before we initiate these processes all over the world and try to make policemen?
Tremendous question, and the next 3 days could be spent. An impossible question to deal with in just a few moments. But there's a tremendous amount of self-righteousness, of hubris, of this country is in a new McCarthy-esque type situation. We don't have the independent institutions that we formerly had. The media is largely owned by corporations, which are largely then owned by the defense industry. The universities, for economic reasons, have more and more become business institutions rather than centers of learning. Scholars have a hard time. In fact, let me just tell you quickly about Professor Charles Black, because this fits him. Charles Black, 30 years at the Yale Law School, one of the biggest names in American constitutional law. A resume of 40 pages of things that he published in his life, of little teeny print. But when he wrote about this subject, when he wrote about what's happening in the Middle East, and this was 10 years ago, and the reason it's important is because those 10 years led to where we are now. When Black wrote his essay, and I'll read you the final paragraph, Osama bin Laden was a loyal Saudi upper-class citizen sitting with King Fahd in the palaces of Riyadh debating the future of Saudi Arabia. So what happened in these 10 years is terribly important. By the way, the reason I mentioned Charles is when he decided to write on this subject after he retired from Yale and was teaching at Columbia, and his wife, in fact, was the dean of Columbia Law School. Nobody in the United States, no publisher, would publish his essay. Not even the Yale Law Journal, which when he left Yale, devoted a whole issue to Charles Black and his career. So the first priority is we need to start looking in the mirror, and we need to start listening to what others are saying about us and to us, because they're not doing that simply to hurt us. Many of them are actually doing that to help us.
very much.
The United States is as guilty of aggravating the situation in the Middle East as you say it is. Would it be in the Middle East's best interest, and the world's best interest for America to pull a withdraw position in the Middle East? And if the answer is no, then what is America's current objective in securing peace in the Middle East? Because currently it seems that we've been achieving nothing except for aggravating the Arabic world with our position in the Middle East.
The United States is in the Middle East not to bring peace, it's there to bring domination. The United States is in the Middle East so that it can pump cheap, plentiful oil from the oil fields of Arabia and artificially fuel our own economy. Some people may think that oil is expensive in this country. Everybody else in the world laughs when Americans say that. Just think for yourself. This is black gold that's pumped halfway around the world, and it's shipped on boats, then it's refined, and then it's sent out to the gas station that we all go to. And it still costs less per gallon than a bottle of a gallon of water at the grocery store. So we're in the Middle East for our own reasons. We're not there to bring peace. We brought defiant regimes, very repressive regimes to most of the Arab countries, the Al-Saudis, the Al-Sabas, the Hashemites. The entire Middle East is ruled by, not the entire, there are some exceptions, but largely corrupt either police states or regimes that are royal families. Israel, of course, is a very special case, and we have provided Israel with at least $100 billion since 1967. That's far beyond what we've provided any other group of countries in the world. And Israel's only 5 million people. 5 million people at this point.
Do you think our control from the Middle East would better the situation?
Well, we don't have that option. There are economic as well as political and strategic reasons. But if you want me to sum up in one sentence what I think we should do, is I think it's high time we realize that people in the Middle East want to have their freedom, they want to have their dignity, they want to have their democracy, they want to have many of the same things that we want to have. But here in this country, we use a certain language, and the previous speaker spoke of hypocrisy. Go anywhere in the world, go to any European coffee shop, or any Middle East, Jerusalem, Cairo coffee shop, and of course the discussion is about the hypocrisy of the Americans, the duplicity of the Americans. There's a tremendous amount of hate, not for the people of this country, but for the policies of this country. And there's a lot of envy as well, because we've done very well compared to the rest of the world. Very complicated situation. But if we don't make some changes, the course that we're now on is totally destructive. We're going to create another generation of Osama bin Ladens, of all kinds of little pockets of deeply buried, deeply underground. And the future is going to be even more chaotic and more bloody than we've witnessed so far.
My question, for all the ills done to the Palestinians, is there any excuse, any justification for September 11th? Also, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, whose people were brutally persecuted, were both successful in achieving freedom without ever raising a hand in violence. Why do the Palestinians now recruit a similar thing?
Well, first of all, the Palestinians are part of actually, I was at the King Center about 3 weeks ago because I spoke at Morehouse College, and I was deeply impressed. It was the first time I'd been to the King Center. And the tradition of Gandhi and Martin Luther King is extremely important. On the other hand, India was a huge civilization with a few thousand British military trying to control it at a time when, at the end of World War II, when the British Empire was depleted. It's not a comparable situation. And it's fine if you want to say violence is not justified under any circumstances and only peaceful nonviolence can be justified. But the primary address that you should be addressing yourself to is Washington, because the biggest perpetrator of violence and destruction in the world is the United States. We use it all the time. civil war is where we're moving both among the Palestinians and the potential among the Israelis as well. No, of course, that's not. The tragedy of the peace process in the Middle East is that there's actually a reasonable solution. It's not totally just. There still would be opposition, but it would have tremendously de-escalated things. The 67 war provided us boundaries. It provided us territory. The idea of a two-state solution emerged. The Palestinian leadership, whatever one thinks of Yasser Arafat, and though I've met with him personally a number of times, I don't think very much of him. But we could have had a two-state solution. It would have been only 22% of Palestine would have become the Palestinian state. Pretty huge compromise on the part of the Palestinian leadership, whatever one thinks about leadership. But now, you can't just change history and move the clock back. You have 167 Israeli settlements. You have bypass roads. You have 250,000 settlers. You have a chaotic situation in the occupied territories. Gaza is the world's largest prison. Do people realize here that 1 million Palestinians and almost everyone your age born in Gaza cannot get out of Gaza? There's an electrified fence that surrounds Gaza, and unless you have special permission from both the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, you can't go anywhere. That's the crucible in which Palestinian children your age have lived their lives, and that's the crucible in which the first female suicide bomber just gave up her life. Most of you have no way to understand the psychological conditions, not to mention the material conditions, that other people in the world are living in, because we've never experienced it ourselves. But it's especially bad when we, the American Empire, are responsible and complicitous. When it's our money, our guns, our tanks, our airplanes, our UN vetoes that make this entire situation possible. And I'll say it from this podium, and I'll say it in public, as difficult as it is, and as much trouble as it causes. I don't believe 9/11 would have happened had, in fact, we had an honest and real and decent peace process in the Middle East, and have we not tried to take everybody for the ride that we have, in fact, taken them on for a very long time.
Do you think that any other peace processes besides, I say peace processes meaning attempts at creating peace, either sponsored by the United States? Do you think that any further U.S.-sponsored efforts, anytime in the future, or external efforts, which have U.S. Representatives, can succeed?
He's asking what other kinds of peace processes could there be, what could possibly succeed. Well, there's the dichotomy. Have we asked ourselves, this all started in the United Nations in 1947. The United Nations passed a resolution, which, by the way, only was passed because the United States did considerable arm twisting to get the resolution passed for Israel's creation. That resolution also said there had to be a Palestinian state at the same time. But have we asked ourselves, what's happened to the United Nations? Why is the peace process not done in New York at UN headquarters, at the Security Council? Why is not the international community involved? Why has the United States taken it on itself that we are in charge of the Middle East? It's our peace process. It's our region. It's our decision who represents whom. And finally, I'll say something else, as controversial as it is, but nevertheless, this is what I believe, and this is what I've come to experience living in Washington. If it weren't for the power and influence of what is euphemistically called the Israeli-Jewish lobby over American political affairs, we wouldn't have this situation. We wouldn't have this kind of attempt by the United States to front for Israel and to create false political arrangements that have been created and all the tension that flows from it. And anybody who says this on American television, as I have a TV I've said on a number of programs. And frankly, this is nothing in private conversations in Washington, or in Cairo, or Jerusalem, or London, or Paris. This is all sort of, common discussion. But here, just like when Professor Black decided to raise his voice and call for a basic change in U.S. policy 12 years ago when he wrote that pamphlet. And had that pamphlet's advice been taken, I don't think 9/11 would have happened, and we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. So, these are very difficult matters. There's a lot of pressures in this country. There's a lot of pressures brought on everybody. And my purpose, since you invited me to come and speak to you, was to tell you, as best I could, what I have done to believe are real issues. Maybe in the future, I'll spend some time trying to write what the solutions are. I guess you can wrap up here.
First off, I'd like to thank you for saying things that aren't always accepted in the best of political patriots of the United States. But with that said, I think internationally, I think we can agree that there's a choice to be made. Do you lead or do you follow? And with that question, I think we've all almost unanimously said that as a great power, a superpower, the United States needs to lead. And so there are bound to be mistakes. You've done us, you've done a great job of looking back to showing us our faults, maybe showing the mistakes that caused this, kind of a study that we miss out on. And I'm sure this has come up previously in the generalities, but I'm asking specifically, what do you think should be done? We've covered what was done and what's not done adequately now, and how the problems arise. But as a person who doesn't know too much about this, as a person who has some interest in politics of the future, what are your guidelines to say what exactly can we do specifically, not in these generalities that we mentioned, so that this can be made into a positive leadership that we need to have, because we can't step back and be involved.
We need leadership in this country that when something like Durban takes place, the United States says to the world, we have our views, we have our own society, we're a powerful country, we have a veto on the Security Council, as you all know, but we're coming to Durban in good faith, we're coming to Durban to listen, we're coming to Durban not to badger, not to bribe, not to cajole, we're coming there because it's important that world society have a feeling and a reality that there is an understanding that America may be the only superpower, but we are still a very small percentage of the human race, and until we start taking their views seriously, and their predicament seriously, and their poverty seriously, and their problems seriously, there's no way that we can make real progress on what you're asking. I see you have a follow-up.
Well, I hope you don't take this offensively, but what I was asking for more was, like I said, a specific action. To say that we need to take people more sincerely, something that's been said many times tonight. I'm saying specifically in the issue that you've discussed in Israel versus Palestine, what specific action can be taken or should be taken in your minds to further that in a true peace way? I mean, to say we need to realize their poverty, that's great, but how should we do it in action, is what I'm asking, in specifics.
Fair enough. And we could go right down the list, except we can't tonight, so I'll take the Arab-Israeli issue. We could say to Israel that we've never supported your settlement policy. We've always told you that that was a problem. It's been condemned by many UN resolutions. You did it on your own. It started in 1967, and now we're not going to send troops to remove your settlements and force anything, but we are no longer going to provide the financial, the political, and the military means for you to continue that occupation. So you're on your own if that's your policy. I mean, we could change what happens in the Middle East not by actually going there and having to do something. All we have to do is stop doing what we're currently doing with our money and with our guns. This, I'm told, is the last question. and it's one we can't hear.
What can the rest of the United Nations, the Security Council in particular, do, if anything, to forward this process?
The UN was structured in a certain way. Once you create a constitutional structure like we have in our country, you can't easily change it. Since the UN is structured in a way that makes America the powerful party, both in terms of how it's financed, in terms of location, in terms of veto power, we have to change. We have to stop voting as much as we do. We have to stop cajoling as much as we do. Let me read you what George Bush said privately. I read it on the plane coming out here today, 3 pages in the Washington Post about what happened 5 days after 9/11 at Camp David. And this is the problem in one little paragraph from today's Washington Post, discussing the meetings taking place between the highest government officials, how to respond to 9/11, what to do. And they're discussing all kinds of options. Mostly the discussion was, should we include Iraq and other people on the first hit list, or should we have a long hit list and start with phases? Of course, they decided to start with phases. But here's the very short paragraph in the middle of the article. The president said he didn't want other countries dictating terms or conditions for the war on terrorism. At some point, the president said, we may be the only ones left. That's okay with me. We are America.